As you probably noticed, seminars will be entirely virtual this year through Zoom on Wednesdays from 3:30 to 4:30. If you're interested, some of the previous seminars have been recorded and are available on the SNR seminar webpage. Dr. Benson will be presenting next week's seminar on November 18th. He will be presenting social behavior, spatial ecology, and population dynamics of top predators. To minimize disruptions by Zoom bombers, the chats will only be directed to the host. So if you have any questions during or after the talk, type them to me and I will read your questions to Jerod. Also, please turn off your videos to minimize any bandwidth issues. And Jerod is an assistant professor and the Knobloch Professor of Migration Ecology and Conservation within the Department of Zoology and Physiology at the University of Wyoming. He is also a research associate with the Wyoming Migration Initiative. Jerod is a quantitative wildlife ecologist with broad interests in understanding how the movement of animals relates to environmental heterogeneity and change, and how these interactions scale to populations and landscape-level ecological processes. Jerod's specific research foci include movement and migration ecology, how cognition and innovation influence foraging behavior, and conservation and management of large mammals. And with that, I will open the floor to Jerod.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction. Thank you, Andy, for inviting me. Thank you for your department for taking me on, and thank you all for being here for this presentation. It's pretty weird to be sitting alone in my office, but talking to 60 people out there. So I hope it goes well, and please don't hesitate if sound gets weird or something. Let me know. But I'm at the university. I think I have pretty good internet, so it should work out pretty well. Yeah, today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research. And the research I'm going to talk about today really extends over the last about 8 years of my career. And it really has a focus on the importance of memory in animal movement. And so let's just dive in. And I think of myself as a movement ecologist, and I think whatever field you're in, you probably have a slide like this to say that your field is important. And I argue that if you look at most ecological processes, you can dig down and find that movement of organisms really can shape those ecological processes. And it's kind of just fun to think about these things. And so look at big movements of animals. You know, they eat in one place, defecate in another, or they are born in one place and die in another. This facilitates redistribution of resources across Earth. Another big one is disease ecology and disease spread, where the movement of the vector and the host is just essential in predicting and understanding how a disease might spread. And then maybe thinking about predator-prey dynamics, where you have a predator that's moving to try to catch a prey, which is also moving away from the predator. And so thinking about the evolution of movement and the strategies that animals use to evade predators and capture prey comes down to the ability to move. Now, movement ecology is basically a new field, even though scientists and even the public have been thinking about animal movement for centuries. But just about 12 years ago, there was a special issue in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science that basically put movement ecology on the map. And they talked about this movement ecology paradigm where we thought about how important movement ecology is to ecology as a discipline. And really this is born out of our ability now to put GPS units on moving animals and track those movements over a large expanse of time, and in some cases, the life of the animal. And so when we kind of think about the theory that underlies this kind of movement ecology paradigm, there's some very simple things that we can take from ecology that this movement ecology framework is built upon. And the first is habitat selection and our theory of habitat selection and understanding how animals use resources more or less than they're available. And we have a huge body of literature thinking about how animals use habitat on the landscape. We also have a huge body of literature on foraging theory, where animals that are foraging on the landscape have some type of foraging currency, time minimizing or maximizing intake of energy. And that should be correlated with fitness such that natural selection should benefit animals that do a good job foraging on the landscape. And then finally, thinking about niche theory and thinking about what are the environmental parameters that explain where we should find a species and what is the role of that species in this kind of dimensional habitat space. And when I look at all these theories that have built movement ecology, there's a common theme here, and that is the environment and habitat. And so movement ecology has really been driven by this idea that animals are responding by moving to habitat in the environment. Now that's great and all, but there's another side to this story. And if you ask a psychologist or an experimental behavioral ecologist, before they do anything with their animals or do any kind of test or an experiment, they want to know, what's the past experience of that animal? Where did it grow up? What has it done in the recent past? And that's going to help you understand what it might do in the future. And so this body of literature about habitat and the environment is kind of missing a big component of how we understand animal behavior, and that is this cognitive component of memory cognition. And just for fun here, there's crazy examples of cognition and memory in animals. And I think one great one is jays and their ability to cache seeds. And not only do they cache seeds, that's interesting, but they can remember hundreds of locations of cached seeds. And not only do they remember the location, but they remember what's in there and how long it's been since they cached it. So that's just exciting that all those cognitive abilities with respect to memory can be used. And then another great example is the ability of other primates such as us to do some pretty amazing cognitive tasks. And I love showing this video because this is a chimp that for just a moment gets basically a map of numbers, and then the numbers disappear, and the chimp remembers not only the location, but it remembers the chronological order of those numbers. And this is something that most of us probably would take, maybe we can't even do it, and it would take us some serious amount of time to learn. And so that's really exciting to see these abilities in other species. Now, jays and primates are some of the most intelligent species, but these memory capabilities don't just stop with the kind of cognitively advanced species that we think about. I mean, invertebrates have abilities. So the waggle dance in the honeybee, not only can these animals remember the direction and the distance to a food source, but then they can explain it to a conspecific. It's amazing. And then cattle and sheep, some of the species that you might think are some of the dumbest animals out there, do amazing on spatial memory tasks in mazes, etc. And so it's ubiquitous across animals, this ability to remember things and use that information in their future. Now, movement ecology can kind of be framed in more of a behavioral context, and really it's about movement ecology is this manifestation of the spatial behavior. And when I think about the movement of an animal, I kind of think about this behavioral model here where we have some kind of an internal state where the animal is hungry or needs to get away from a predator or wants to mate. And that internal state then determines that behavior, where they move to and where they go. And in the kind of general movement ecology framework, that habitat framework, we have these extrinsic factors, available habitat, predator distribution, conspecifics, etc. And this really moves through the behavioral model, and in a spatial context, over time we get the spatial distribution of an animal, so maybe a home range or a migration route. And then we have fitness. So what it does behaviorally will have a fitness consequence, whether it dies or lives or gives birth or puts on pounds or puts on fat, etc. Now, oftentimes when we think about movement ecology and think about spatial behavior, often it stops here. And what I'd like to really kind of push and reveal is that there's a whole different component, and that's this intrinsic kind of cognitive memory component to this that drives that internal state, where then to the behaviors, etc. And what this provides is a feedback that we all know is happening on the landscape, that these animals are moving to new places, acquiring information, learning about them, figuring out, is it good food, or did my young survive or get killed by a predator there? That information can then be used in a feedback loop to again motivate the internal state and the behavior. And so what I'm going to do today is basically dance around at some of these connections in this behavioral framework under this broad question of what is the relative role of memory, or those intrinsic factors, versus those extrinsic factors such as habitat in shaping animal movement. And I've been working on this question for a decade, and I'm going to show you my research from it. And I'm going to break my talk into 3 components. And so the first is going to be thinking about the movements of bison in Prince Albert National Park in Saskatchewan. And these animals basically live in a national park and have pretty small ranges, for especially relatively for a bison. And then we're going to transition to thinking about ungulate migration here in Wyoming. And at the very end, we're going to look at how memory influences the response of animals to development and rapid development on the landscape. And so let's just jump in here. And the first thing to think about is, how might an animal remember and integrate its past experience? Like what are the first steps of this? And what can we hypothesize to explain how an animal might use its past experience or memory? And so imagine we have a landscape with some patches. These gray areas are places where there is food, and then the white space is basically matrix habitat between the places where there's food. And we can imagine an animal on the landscape, and we can imagine that animal over time moves through that landscape. And one of the first things we can think about, and one of the simplest things we can think about, is potentially the animal can remember where it has been in the past. So it can develop spatial memory, or you might want to call it a cognitive map, of the locations that it has visited in the past. And if it is doing that, and we take into account all the different factors that might predict why an animal would go somewhere, like habitat quality, we would predict that these animals would be able to selectively return to places they've been to in the past, granted they did not die there, obviously. And then the next thing we can expect for what animals could remember in their past experience is also very simply some information about whether their past experience was good or bad. And obviously, in the real world, patches of food, some are better than others. And what the animals can do is remember, and this is the simplest version, is remember what we call a reference point. And so it's kind of like a running average of your past experience. And so if you've been going to some really great restaurants for a few days, and then you bump into a really bad restaurant, your reference point is really good. And so you don't actually have to remember the exact location connected to the quality of that location, but you can just keep a running average of how good your recent past experience is. And then simply, you can selectively return when you bump into a poor quality patch. And so this bison had 2 really good patches, and then it hit a brown one, a poor quality patch, and it was like, oh, this is not a good area that I'm heading into. I can turn around and go back. So we tested these very simple predictions of memory-based movement using some data from Prince Albert National Park, plains bison. They're free-ranging, so they do go outside the park a bit, but in general, they're inside this park in the southwest corner. And this research is really in collaboration with Daniel Fortin and Seth Cherry. Daniel Fortin is a professor at University of Laval, and Seth Cherry is a wildlife ecologist, a research ecologist with Parks Canada. So they were the leads on these projects on bison in Prince Albert National Park. And the great thing about Prince Albert National Park is it is a great place to understand how animals like bison move from patch to patch. And so it's mostly forested, but it's punctuated by these meadows, and bison eat grass. And so bison mainly live in meadows. But when they leave one meadow, they have to decide what meadow to go to next, because they don't want to get lost in this thick forest of the southwest part of Prince Albert National Park. So we kind of capitalized on this importance of selecting the next meadow for bison when they leave one meadow. And so what we developed is kind of a patch selection modeling framework, where we basically compared the meadow that they left, the meadow that they went to other options that they could have gone to from the patch that they came from, or the meadow they came from. This is kind of what we call a step selection function framework. And then we can understand why the animal went to the place that it did compared to the other options that it had around it. So what we did is we built this base model that has everything that you can think of that's important for an animal or a bison selecting a meadow. How big is that meadow? How far is that meadow away? How connected is that meadow to other meadows? And then we did a huge amount of vegetation sampling to develop an awesome map of the expected forage quality that bison would obtain in every single meadow in this landscape. And so we built a model with all these things, which kind of takes into account the habitat component of those meadows. And then we asked, do they still select or use more often than you'd expect places they've been to in the past? And then we also calculated that reference point. So we had a running average of their past experience and looked at how that influenced how they return to places they've been to in the past. A bit less returning. And then if we add that reference point on the x-axis, so values on the right-hand side are larger reference points, which means recent past experience is really good compared to this thing you just bumped into. And indeed, in these cases, when these animals bump into a poor quality place compared to what they were just doing, they're much more likely to turn around. And we found very clear evidence of this. And this really supports both this spatial memory as well as this attribute memory with a reference point. And so that's pretty exciting. And that really kind of shows us that both extrinsic and intrinsic factors are really driving the behavior and the movement of these animals. Now, I want to just take it a couple of steps further and explain to you a little bit about how this behavior, how this memory-based behavior also influences the spatial distribution of these bison. And so what we did is we used simulation. We developed some simulated landscapes, and you can see that the landscape on the right here is pretty clumpy. So some areas have really good patches of meadows, and the places in blue are kind of clumps of poor quality patches. And what we did is we used individual-based simulation to put animals on that landscape with a memory-based foraging tactic, and then we just let it go over time, let them move around that landscape over time. And what we calculated was a very simple thing called mean square displacement. And what that is basically how far do they go from their starting point over time. And so if you compare it to an animal that just moves randomly on that landscape, over time, they just slowly get away from their starting point, just moving randomly on the landscape. But then if we give an animal with memory capabilities and an interest in returning, that distance that they go away starts to asymptote and slow down over time. And then if we give them a reference point, we really see strong asymptotic displacement values. And what this shows us is that if these animals, I'm going to use my mouse here, are in a great patch of meadows like this red area here, And then they go to the edge of it and they bump into a blue patch, which means that their reference point is really high. So they had good experience in the red area, and then they bumped into a blue area. They're much more likely to turn around. And so what this very simple memory-based tactic does is it makes these animals kind of stick in good patches and good areas of the landscape. And what that's showing us is how a home range for an animal is formed. Very simply is how they can use memory to keep in an area and develop a home range. Now, indeed, once we kind of saw this result, it's like, okay, well, how does this relate to home range size? And so every individual in the population has a different kind of odds of returning or probability of turning around in circle or going back to places before. And so we capitalized on that individual variation and then also calculated home range size of those animals. And indeed, what we see is a nice relationship. The more memory that the animals use and the more returning that they do, the smaller the home range that they have. It's quite simple. And so what's cool about this very simple result is that we've now connected dots between memory use, behavior, and then the resulting spatial distribution of a population or an individual, and how a home range might be formed. Okay, so now I want to shift gears a little bit and take you to Wyoming, and we're going to tell you a couple stories about Wyoming to get started. And so before I jump in, I want to just acknowledge that all the research I'm going to show you from here on out is in strong collaboration with Matt Kaufman, Hall Sawyer, Kevin Monteith, and the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. I mean, a lot of this research is collaborative, and we all work together to create the research that you're about to see. Okay, so going back to the story. So back in about 2010, Hall Sawyer was asked by the BLM to study this desert mule deer population down in Rock Springs, near Rock Springs. And so Hall Sawyer bought some collars. They were store on board collars, and in the winter, I think, of 2010 and 11, they put them out on about 45 deer, and they were store on board collars. So Hall just had to wait a couple years. And then finally, about 2013 or so, all the collars came off, and Hall Sawyer brought those back into his office, downloaded the data, and plotted it. And not only were these animals not desert living animals year round, but the vast majority of them made the longest migration that we know for mule deer. And so this discovery was just fantastic, and it really sparked a lot of the Wyoming Migration Initiative, which is, you may have heard of that we have in Wyoming, and just kind of the momentum for how exciting and how important migration is in large mammals and in ungulates. And so that was a really exciting thing, and that really kind of sparked a lot of the work that we do, is this discovery. And so we've been monitoring animals out there ever since that original study. And in the winter of 2016, we put another collar, we were continuing to put collars out. And in the summer of 2016, I was a postdoc at the time, and I was asked to download the data and plot it. And what I found when I plotted the data was another big surprise. And we had put a collar on an animal that not only did this 150-mile migration, but then continued on and went even farther. And it made us had to change the scale of the map. And this animal moved all the way into the northeast, the eastern part of Idaho. And the cool thing about this is we were like, oh my goodness, this is definitely the biggest migration we've ever seen. But we didn't know if the animal returned, so it could have been a dispersal event. And so we were just excited about seeing what was going to happen in the fall. But of course, the collar failed that summer. And so we lost all contact with that collar. And Matt Kaufman and I went out there, and we wanted to make sure that the animal wasn't dead. And so we went out there with VHF and at least saw the animal, and it was still alive. And in this picture, there is a deer, and that's deer 255, and that's summer of 2016. And so we knew it was still alive, but the collar failed, and that was maybe the end of the story. Okay, I'll come back to that in a little bit. So migratory movements, and obviously you can just probably tell by the sound of my voice that migration is exciting to me. And not only ungulate migration, but all the migrations of these animals, just spectacular. I mean, thinking about the longest migratory animal there is, the Arctic tern, that's basically living its entire life in summer. It's spending our summers in Greenland and our winters down in the southern or near the Antarctic. What a great life to have. And then you have things like 1.2 wildebeest that move in this figure-8 migration pattern in the Serengeti. It's kind of mind-boggling that these things are happening. And so where we're at with migration ecology is thinking about why animals migrate, and we have a pretty good grasp of that, and I'll mention why in just a moment. But really, we're learning about, really the question nowadays is, how do they do this? And with the new tracking technology, we can start to understand this. And so why they migrate, especially in temperate mountainous environments, is really that migration is this solution to dealing with higher elevation summer ranges that have great precip, great plant productivity, but in the winter are basically inhospitable because of snow. Whereas the winter range might have much less vegetation productivity, but they are tolerable in winter. And I use tolerable because of, if anybody's spent any time in the winter in Wyoming, it's not paradise. So anyway, this is basically the main reason that ungulates migrate, especially here in Wyoming. It's the solution to this kind of dealing with vegetation, maximizing where you can get good vegetation, and minimizing the costs of harsh winter and snow. So coming back to this story of Deer 255, we kind of wrote her off, and it was pretty sad. And in the winter of 2018, we were out there capturing some animals, and we always tell the helicopter crew, if you see an animal out there with a collar, and even if that collar isn't working, recapture it. Kevin Monteith and Matt Kaufman, they're really interested in long-term data sets. We've learned so much from long-term data sets. And so we want to recapture animals that we've monitored in the past. And sure enough, this day in March in 2018, I'm sitting there, working on a deer, and I heard the helicopter crew talking to the graduate student, Anna Ortega at the time, and they said, "Oh, we picked up an animal with a collar that's not working. Here's the serial number." And I just remember Anna looking up and saying, "You guys, this is 255. This is the animal." And so there she was. She was back on winter range. We had lost contact with her for nearly 2 years, but she was back down there by Rock Springs. And so we dug through the collar box and put the collar on that looked the best and worked the best. And sure enough, the next spring of 2018, she made the same exact migration again. Just amazing. And it solidified that this was definitely a migration because she was coming back and doing it again. And so this was the discovery of the last few years, and pretty exciting stuff. And now, when I look at this map, though, you can see that she walked on almost the same route for 250 miles. And it's just mind-boggling to me, how do these animals do this? And mule deer have we call strong fidelity. And this is what you're seeing here is a map of 2 individual animals that were monitored for 6 years each. So there are 12 lines for each of those animals. So a spring migration and a fall migration. And so what we're showing you here is these animals are walking on the same path year after year. And so thinking about how are they doing this and how are they not making mistakes is quite amazing. And so going back to my original question and thinking about how do these animals migrate, I want to know, what is the relative role of memory versus habitat in shaping, in this case, animal migration? And so that's the question I've been chasing after for the last few years. And so what we did to start tackling this question is we pulled some different data sets from Wyoming and southern Colorado, and we isolated the migration sequences, And we did this similar kind of step selection function framework where we looked at where the animal went and compared it to where the animal could have gone during migration. And again, we built this kind of baseline model with every habitat variable we can think of. We put elevation, slope, and aspect, and everything we could think of. And we even included habitat variables that are dynamic in nature. So you can imagine green up occurs at different times in different places on the landscape. We've included that as a variable. That's the idea of green wave surfing, which I'm not going to get into today. But we feel strongly that we really built, to the best of our knowledge, the best habitat model we could. And then we added two variables that represent memory. And we said, is there a bias towards the previous year's summer range? So are the animals walking toward or away from their previous year's summer range? And is there a bias toward the previous year's migration route itself? And these are both spatial memory components. And so here's what we found. And so what I'm showing here is those variables are up and down that y-axis here, and then on the x-axis is effect size. And what that simply means is, what is the effect of each of these variables on the movements of these animals during migration? And so the bigger the value, the more effect they have. And, I'm not going to go through this, but typical things, while they're migrating in spring, they go to higher elevations, they go on south-facing slopes, and they et cetera. I don't need to go through it. But what's most important here is when you throw the memory variables in here, they have such a stronger effect size than any of these habitat variables. It's kind of amazing. And in fact, if we look across the populations, we can see that memory has up to 5 to 28 times the effect size on migration compared to any other significant habitat variables. And so what this is telling us is that not only is external habitat factors playing a role in migration, but they're playing less of a role than this memory intrinsic factor, or this intrinsic component of migration. And so the next thing we wanted to look at is what are the kind of fitness benefits in terms of forage gain or food quality over time by having the ability to migrate these big long distances. And so we used simulation again, and we simulated these animals in the real landscape this time, and we gave them the extrinsic factors. So maybe they were just moving with respect to local perception of higher quality forage or better elevation or something like that. And then we gave them memory-based components, ability to remember and use their past experience. And what I'm showing you here on the y-axis is kind of like the average quality of the forage that they would obtain. And so what we see here is that when the animals don't have any memory, they get a value of around 15. The values don't really matter. But this is what they get by being able to use extrinsic factors and use their perceptual range to go to places based on habitat. But once we give them memory of their previous experience and this kind of knowledge of this big long migration route and this distant seasonal range, what we see is they can capitalize on such a bigger gradient of forage quality because they know they need to get up to those places and move along these routes on the landscape. And it's almost 3 times the forage benefit when the animals can use memory to migrate. And so this is pretty exciting. And I understand this is just basic forage benefits, but this is pretty shocking about when the animal can just kind of see the landscape at this huge scale, they can exploit much more of the forage that's available to them in that landscape. I think I'm going to skip this slide. And so what I've shown you here is that for the migratory component, these intrinsic factors are super important, and in fact more important than the available habitat in predicting where these animals go. And that has strong impacts on their fitness with respect to forage gain. Okay, so maybe you've been thinking about this when I was talking about it, but these animals have memory of their past experience. But where does that memory come from in the first place? And when we were doing these analyses, that was a big question we kept thinking about is, okay, this is great, but how do they get that information in the first place? And the obvious thing is that they learn it early in their life. And so we kind of started tackling this question about how does migration develop? And if you look into the bird literature, we know that some species of birds, they literally have a genetic innate ability or interest in migrating in spring and fall. I mean, it's genetically programmed and it's innate. Whereas there's some other bird species that need to learn their migration routes, and they don't just have a genetic component. And so we wanted to know, where are these ungulates falling across this gradient? And so what we did is we capitalized on the fact that we've translocated bighorn sheep and moose all over the West over the last century or so for conservation purposes. And we looked at movement or GPS collar data in these newly reintroduced herds or herds that have been introduced for many years or decades. And we had a look at their movements and their behavior in those places. And so the first thing we found is pretty simple, and this is in the bighorn sheep data, that reintroduced populations within the first 2 years of being reintroduced or translocated really aren't migrating much. They don't have this clean up and back movement between two distinct seasonal ranges. It's really much more messy data. Whereas some of these more established herds or historical herds, they're all migrating to some extent. And so that was the first thing. And that really tells us that it's not a genetic thing. I mean, ungulates are not just migrating because they have a genetic or an innate interest in going uphill in spring. It must be something else. And so what we decided to do was develop kind of this index of the knowledge of the environment that these animals have. And so what the index is simply, what do these animals exploit based on the GPS collar data compared to what they could have exploited if they actually had we just drew a bigger circle around their movements and said, here's what they could do. And so that ratio is really important. And what we see is that indeed, this ratio of what they do versus what they could do is much better in historical populations. And what that means is those animals have better knowledge of the environment, exploiting more of the environment that they could exploit compared to these translocated populations. So they're starting out with less knowledge and less and exploiting less of the forage that's out there. And then if you plot this over time and we add in the moose data and other bighorn sheep populations that have been on the landscape for different decades, what we see is this knowledge of the environment creeps up over time. And it's not quick, but it's slowly creeping up over time. And what that suggests is there's a learning component to the ability of these animals to exploit the options that they have to them. And inevitably, as they learn about this landscape, they become more migratory. And this is the exciting result, looking at how long since migration and the percent of that population that's migratory. And the big take homes here are that this is not something that is learned quickly. This is something that is learned over many generations because of the time it takes to learn it. We call this cultural, like kind of a cultural transmission of knowledge. So mom passes it on to the young maybe improve it just a little bit, and then they pass it on to their young, et cetera, et cetera. So it takes time to develop that information and develop that memory or knowledge for an individual animal. Okay, so now I showed you a little bit about how learning and memory kind of feed back into the behavior of these animals, and also connected it a bit with the spatial distribution and how we actually might see migration developing out of pretty simple movements. Okay, so let's go to the last section of my talk, which is thinking about the role of memory in shaping how animals respond to rapid environmental change. And this is a question that many of us are working on. And I think it's an exciting and important question. And I want to show you kind of my slant on how this works and how I kind of see it shaping out. And even though I just said my slant on this, all this work is really led by Mallory Lambert, who's a master's student of mine, who's been working with me for a few years and just done an amazing job taking some old data sets that you'll see here and reanalyzing them in this just a cool new way and making some new conclusions that I think we never would have had without these the exciting and the energy of a graduate student going down these paths. So this is the work of Mallory in collaboration with Hall Sawyer and myself. And so we always see these slides and talks. You know, we're changing the landscape for these animals. We're making roads, we're reducing habitat, or we're taking away native habitat. We have climate change, we have urbanization, et cetera. And in the West, one of the biggest things that we deal with is energy development. And you know, there's also housing development as well, but energy development is a big thing. And just in the last 2 decades, we've developed 3 million hectares of the land that's just well pads and roads. And that's 3 Yellowstones just in the West in the last 2 decades. So it's an important thing. And so understanding how these animals respond to it, and more importantly, is there some amount of development that they can handle before it has consequences for those populations? And so the way Mallory and I have been thinking about this is thinking about movement mechanisms. And there's really 2 general movement mechanisms that animals employ when they're moving on the landscape. And the first is this kind of local oriented perceptual mechanism where the animal is using eyesight, smell to identify a forage plant and move towards it, or to detect a predator that's nearby and run away from it. These are oriented perceptual movements. But there's another type of movement where the animal has a cognitive map or some spatial memory of a place that it wants to go to that's far away, that it cannot perceive, but wants to go there. And we call this kind of a memory-based movement. And so what we kind of hypothesized is that I wonder if memory, depending on the type of movement mechanism that is employed, these animals might respond to development in a different way. And what we did is there's a very clear distinction between when an animal is on their seasonal range, like winter range, clearly they're using much more oriented perceptual movements to move around in this small area. Whereas during migration, as I showed you in the previous research, they're using memory-based movements to make those movements. And so we could compare the 2 and how animals interact with development and think about what the differences are. And so Mallory's work takes place on the Pinedale anticline, which is kind of a plateau or a ridge just south of Pinedale. And it's the 6th largest natural gas field in the lower 48. And there's both pronghorn and mule deer that winter in that area and migrate through that development. And so we capitalized on that and assessed how the animals interact with the development during migration and on winter range. And just to give you a little background on the Pinedale anticline, I mean, this place was pretty pristine, untouched sagebrush habitat just 2 decades ago. And since then, we've seen the development of this gas field. And this just gives you an idea. I mean, about a 10-fold increase in the amount of surface disturbance in this area over the last 2 decades. Oops. And so what we basically did was there's been collars, Hall Sawyer has been kept collars on this population for the last 15 years. And what we simply did is did a whole bunch of habitat selection analyses at different scales across pronghorn and mule deer. And what came out of this is quite simple. And that is, while these animals are on winter range, the use of the habitat or use of surface disturbance, use of the habitat with surface disturbance begins to decline immediately as soon as there's any surface disturbance. So they start avoiding these places. And what that tells us is that when they're in this perceptual area, this perceptual movement mechanism, as soon as there's a change on the landscape, they avoid it. They start to move away from it a bit. Whereas during migration, what we find is there's this small amount that they're willing to withstand or tolerate. And so during migration, these animals are dealing with some of the development and don't change their migratory path until a certain threshold is met, and then they start changing their behavior. And we saw this in both mule deer and pronghorn, and we saw this across a bunch of different scales. And so what this is telling us is that when these animals are using their memory and trying to get to this distant place, they're willing to deal with some changes on the landscape and focus on their past experience. Whereas when they're on winter range and thinking about changes in their perceptual view and where the food is, they're much more likely to quickly adjust, immediately adjust to those changes on the landscape. Now, thinking about fidelity and the idea that these animals are using their memory so strongly that they're staying along the same paths, et cetera, or the same winter ranges, is kind of an interesting component to this. And that is, and you can do this for the migration routes as well, but if you just look at fidelity to winter range over the last 20 years, these animals at the population scale are using the same area, the same winter range, even though all this development has occurred. And so, yes, I just showed you they're making some fine-tuned changes and they're spending less time near development, but the general winter range is about the same. And at the same time, we've seen a population decrease of 40%. And so I understand that correlation is not causation, but taking these things together, this clearly, it demonstrates pretty strongly that this species is sitting there, this is the place they live, they have strong memory-based behavior, and they're not adjusting that quickly to these big changes on the landscape. And so what I've shown you here is this kind of connection between extrinsic and intrinsic factors and how that influences animal behavior. I've connected it with spatial distribution, home ranges and migration routes, and connected it in some ways to fitness. And I hope you're convinced that the importance of memory and intrinsic factors, it is playing a strong role in the movement of these animals. And in fact, in some cases, it's a stronger role. And what I'd like to do for the last 2 minutes is just leave you with a couple of final thoughts. And this is just from me, kind of what I think is most important from the research that I showed you today. I have 3 of them. And the first one is just the definition of habitat. And we, animal ecologists, have squabbled about the definition of habitat for decades. And we think about, is it a vegetation type, or is it a vegetation community, or is it land cover, et cetera. But I think what my work is really demonstrating to us is that the definition of habitat isn't just about habitat and the environment. It's really interaction between the environment and the animal's knowledge. Has the animal ever been there? Does it know it? And if it doesn't know it, it may not be habitat to that animal. And so that's the first thing I want to kind of keep in mind for everybody thinking about habitat and this interaction with knowledge and memory. The second thing is, I touched on this a bit in a couple of the studies, is that when these animals are relying on past experience to make behavioral decisions and move, we're going to see lags in the response of these individuals and populations. They're not going to respond to things that we change that quickly. And what that means is populations or individuals or species with memory-based movements don't have a lot of behavioral plasticity. So they aren't changing their behavior from day to day in order to deal with changes. They're focused on what they've done in the past. And what that means is we're going to see lags in behavior. And so we might throw some collars out on a population, and we might look at, oh, these animals are doing just fine from a behavioral standpoint. But in the background, it might simply be that what you collared are some animals that figured it out, and the other animals that didn't figure it out are potentially already dead. And so we have to remember that memory-based species and individuals that are using memory-based movements are not going to respond that quickly to changes on the landscape. And the last thing is kind of a conservation implication of lost movements and migrations. And when these animals are relying on memory and they're able to migrate because of their past experience and because of that cultural knowledge, if we lose a population or a herd, we're not just losing that population, we're losing all the knowledge that that herd has. And so we have to be very cautious about this when we think about conservation, because restoration is going to be way more difficult, because the new animals we put there won't have the knowledge of that landscape, and it will take decades for them to learn it again and to see what we might have seen in the past. And so with that, I would like to thank the partners and funding sources for all this research. None of this research could be possible without all the collaborations on both the bison project and some of the ungulate migration projects here, and then all the funding partners. So I want to definitely thank them for collaborating with me and funding this research. And I'd love to take any questions if we have a little time, and if there are some questions.
Thank you, Jerod. It'll take just a couple minutes for the questions to roll in.
Yep, that's fine. Was the sound okay? There was no blips or anything the whole time?
Sounded great to me.
Good.
I have a question. How did you get started researching migration and stuff like that? What made you interested?
Well, so the story is that I was doing that bison work in Saskatchewan, and I was really thinking about memory from this kind of home ranging, kind of fine scale, smaller behavior, I guess, if you want to say it. And, I was thinking about memory a lot. And then I remember watching, I know this sounds cheesy, but I remember watching Matt Kaufman give a talk, and I was like, whoa, these animals are doing some incredible things. And obviously I'd thought about memory a lot, and I was like, we got to figure this out. I think there's got to be a lot of memory components to this. And so watching that talk kind of got me hooked on it, and that's, the rest is history.
All right, I just got a question from Heather Abernathy, and she says, "Hi, I have a comment/question. Great talk, Jerod. Very interesting stuff. Have you all seen mule deer acclimate to development at the perception scale? If no, could that lack of acclimation also contribute to the population decline, i.e. getting pushed off optimal habitat, increased stress, etc.?"
Yeah, so Hall Sawyer has two papers where he has assessed responses to the development over time. And I think the kind of acclimation hypothesis would be that at the very beginning, they move away from the development, and then over time, they start to move back. But honestly, in both of those papers, Hall Sawyer's analyses did not support that idea. So they moved away from development and have stayed away from development since then. So we don't have any evidence of acclimation or habituation to that development. And just a note on that, these animals do use these areas sometimes. Like, they do spend time near the wells and near the roads. It's just on average, their movements are spending more time farther away. Heather, if you want to email me, I'll send you those papers too.
All right, then I have a question from, just a second, it disappeared. I have a question from Adrian, who says, "I have a question. In the case of captive bred animals that are released in one region and 6 months later translocated to another region, what do you think is the role of memory after the second translocation?"
Very interesting. That's a good question. And I think I'm assuming these landscapes are completely different, and, spatial memory is a moot point. I think you're going to see basically naivety from the spatial component. Now, I think what plants the animals might eat, or if it's a predator, what it's going to try to kill, that might be determined by what it experienced in that first place. So what the plants were there, maybe it would go after plants that also are similar. But I think from a spatial component, I think you're going to probably see pretty complete naivety and relearning of these places. Good question, though. That's a good question.
All right, and Heather says, great, thank you. I will do that. And then Tyler Neely asks, did you happen to record any areas of displacement in certain spots where the herds you studied it just disappeared again. Studied interacted with forest fires? If so, how did these herds respond to the new disruptions to their habitat? Was it similar to their reactions with the roads being built?
That's a good question. And a few of us a couple of years ago tried to pull all the data in Wyoming and maybe in some other states as well, or at least we were talking to folks about it, how often we have an animal's data in one year, and then a burn happens, like let's say on summer range, and then we continue to have data afterwards. And there's not a lot out there of that. I mean, we have little specklings of this across, and it would be fun to do that analysis. But anecdotally, and I know we've been talking about this because we had that big fire west of Laramie this year, there were a few mule deer collared in that fire, and they did not move. They did not, they just stayed in the same home range, and the fire went through and they're alive and just fine. And so anecdotally, and I feel like field biologists are going to know better about this, but anecdotally, even in a pretty severe fire, I think for mule deer, their fidelity is pretty high. And in many cases, there was a kind of a secondary part to that question, that is that going to affect their populations? Well, we know that fire can be quite good for certain plant species. And if the ungulate, let's say elk, because that's a classic case, that they really do well in fire areas because the correct plant species grow after the fire. And what's interesting is even in that fire west of Laramie, we had a little bit of snow, and then we've had pretty warm weather. And if you go up there, there's a bit of green up, even in those burnt areas. And so there is a bit of food, even after a pretty harsh fire like that, that comes back. I mean, obviously in the really heavily burnt areas, it might take some time. But that's anecdotal evidence. I hope you don't quote me on that, but I think some of these animals stay in those areas.
All right, then Nathan Rank says, hi, fantastic and inspiring talk. Could it be that memory-based foraging help animals to adapt to changes within their home range? The memory of alternative resource patches could facilitate changes. This would imply that the benefit cost of memory-based movement and scale and behavior dependent.
I'm sorry, could you repeat it? Say it one more time.
Yeah. From Nathan, hi, fantastic and inspiring talk. Could it be that memory-based foraging help animals to adapt to changes within their home range? The memory of alternative resource patches could facilitate changes. This would imply that the benefit cost of memory-based movement are scale and behavior dependent.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I have a paper where I did some simulation, and we just increased the amount of memory that these animals have. And what happens is that they become really good foragers to a point. And then when they have too much memory and they just only rely on their past experience, they get stuck in little poor quality places of the landscape. And so there is definitely a trade-off to learning about your environment, memorizing it, and using that information versus adding in a little random movement here and there and trying to try some new patches every once in a while. And I think, I don't think we know about that balance very well. And I think different species and different populations are going to balance that differently depending on the landscape they live in. And I think that's a great avenue for future research is really understanding that balance of using memory versus trying some new things over time. Thanks for that question. That was great.
All right, then I have a question from Larkin Powell. Jerod, excellent overview here. And some things I haven't thought about. How do you tease apart memory factors of individuals with effects of following others in the group? Male mallards end up going to areas for breeding that were not their birthplace because they follow females they met on the wintering ground. Similarly, effects of best paths to get from A to B, maybe B, is the only good place and one way to get there. I guess I'm asking if there are cautions you have about when we say is memory effect and when it is something that looks like memory effect.
Great question. And I think we're, on the ungulate side, we're just scratching the surface of how the group dynamics and the sociality play a role in this memory-based movements. But just a couple of things to mention about this is, one, I do have another project that I did in the past where I found, you can see it in GPS collar data that if one animal gets in a group with another, and that other animal, that other group has some different knowledge, this animal that moved into that group has a higher probability of going to a new place they've never been to, based simply on getting into that group. And so in that research, what we found is that the group dynamics facilitates and has a strong impact on your own learning experience and what you become exposed to. And so what it can do, like, fusion fission dynamics or groups coming in and out, really facilitates information acquisition through simply just, I went with a new group and I went to a new place. And so that's some research on bison, but we don't know about that with migration. And I actually have a student that's going to start tackling that question here. And let me just say one more thing about that question is, one time I looked at, in that migration model, that step selection where we looked at how you move given your own past experience. Well, what I tried how do you move given other animals in the group's past experience? And what we found, though, is that your own past experience is more important than anybody else in your group, or that anybody else that migrated in that area. And what that tells me is that even though, and this was in mule deer, even though they're migrating in groups, an individual's past experience is more important than the experience of those other animals in that group. And so that's a little different than what we found with bison. I haven't published that yet, but down the road, I really want to kind of flesh that out and really understand what exactly is going on. So great question.
Then I have a question, from Joseph. Josephus, who asked, great presentation, thank you so much. Who are the primary end users of your research?
So good question. I think some of my research that's a little more on the fundamental ecology side is really geared more towards other scientists and just getting a better understanding of the ecology of animal movement. But it also is uncovering some pretty neat aspects of migration that help us just think about how important migration is to the ecosystem and how these animals do that. And so it just it's good information for us to understand the importance of migration. Now, some of my other research I showed you with the development, the end users are very much state agencies or federal agencies that are trying to figure out how to allow development without impacting the animal, minimizing the impact on animals. And so, for instance, some of those thresholds that we found with response to surface disturbance, those thresholds can be used to inform policy that helps guide how the development could occur, so it minimizes that impact on wildlife. So I try to have my research touching on the science component as well as the applied component at the same time.
All right, and then there is a question from Ellie. How about memory for predators? Are they building a spatial memory or just tracking ungulate movement?
Well, that's a good question. So I wonder who this Ellie is, but I'm just going to assume I don't know. I think I know who it is. My first thought is a predator could learn about the distribution of the food of its prey, and it could remember that and try to revisit those areas more often than you might expect other areas. So that's one thing it could do, and I think the jury is out whether that's actually occurring. The other thing is, especially for like a wolf, that some of the year it's tied to a den. We get into kind of a central place foraging framework where that animal needs to develop a cognitive map of how it can efficiently make it to a foraging area and then come back to the den site. And so I've always thought about memory for a predator is those two things. Excuse me, I have one more thing too. So those two things, and then the third one is remembering your territory boundary. Because if you're a predator and you're a territorial predator, you don't want to screw up and be wandering into the next pack's area because you could get killed if you're by yourself. And so I think those three things are the main components of memory that I would expect in a more of a predatory animal. Good question though. And I don't know all the answers. That was just me speculating a bit.
And that's all the questions I have.
Great.
Yeah, that's all I've got too. Well, thanks, Jerod. Greatly appreciate it. I wish we could give you a big round of applause, but thank you so much for participating in the seminar.
You're very welcome. And yeah, thank you everyone for being here. It was great questions and I see some clapping, so I appreciate it. So yeah, thank you guys. Do I need to stay on or anything? Are we done?
No,
or
you're good to go. You're good to go.